So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now starting the afternoon session on finance and climate change. The panel is already on the podium. Governor Visco, whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much. Welcome back. Obviously, starting this afternoon session after this rich lunch will be hard, but I hope this will flow like the sessions we had this morning. Now, the global community is showing, as we have understood from all what has been said up to now, a substantial growing awareness of the dramatic repercussions of climate change. Now, this is clearly increasingly affecting both the economies and the societies where we live. Its financial implications are encouraging financial institutions to use their resources and their catalytic capacity to push for faster change in production and through also an engagement and capital allocation which is somehow green. These developments have provided a major boost, therefore, to the analysis of climate-related risks, which elicit further interest within the financial sector. ESG, that is environmental, social, and governance scores, had been computed for some time for listed companies for years, by specialized institutions. We in the Bank of Italy have used them at length. There is a wide divergence between those who provide these scores, so you have really to pick and choose and be very careful. But now they are carefully considered by investors, and we will hear something about that, I suppose, together with the traditional economic and financial determinants of the creditworthiness of firms. In the last few years, sustainable finance has grown significantly, is now a market trend in its own right, still rather small, I think, but it has showing a substantial growth in the last few years. It has increased by 60% since 2015. Now, this trend brings potentially large benefits. It stimulates conversion from brown to green activities, but it is not without risks. The key one that we all are familiar with is the greenwashing. That is the funding of activities that appear to be sustainable only on the surface. It is a risk amplified by the lack of a comprehensive and universally accepted taxonomy of sustainable activities. The demand for more and better data to measure the impact of climate change on the economy and on the financial system is therefore strong. Now, central banks, Christine, can play, as you often say, an important role in supporting the transition towards net zero emissions. As financial investors ourselves, central bankers, many of us have started to apply sustainability criteria to our own non-monetary portfolios. As micro and macro prudential supervisors, we need to assess whether intermediaries take climate-related risks sufficiently, so carefully, correctly into account, and whether these risks threaten the overall financial stability. And then we have monetary policy. Certainly, we need to do better to integrate climate risks into our models and operations. This is an issue that at the ECB we have studied carefully during the review of our strategy. As I've noted on other occasions, however, there is now a lot of emphasis on the financial system. Central banks and the financial sector seem to be, I would say, burdened, if I may use that word, with substantial expectations. And the question is whether these expectations are rightly placed, are excessive or not. There is indeed the risk, I think, that disproportionate focus on the financial sector may become somehow an excuse for governments not to act or act less than would be necessary. Finance facilitates investment indeed, but cannot create green assets if there are no productive activity behind these assets. So we must not forget that the primary responsibility of addressing climate change rests first and foremost with the national governments. We have listened to them this morning. There is a variety of approaches. I'd say there is a majority of persons in their capacities as ministers really somehow to push for much more use of carbon pricing, but there is obviously some hesitation on going too far on the tax approach, but clearly it is national governments that have the required democratic legitimacy to apply the most suitable tools, be those the lifting of carbon taxes or making the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions more severe, providing subsidies or removing subsidies on fossil fuels, and tax incentives to green activities. Now we will discuss these and other topics in this session, together with a number of very distinguished speakers, starting with Larry Fink, who is the chairman and CEO of BlackRock, Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank, Paolo Gentiloni, who is the European Commissioner for Economy, and Linda Elling-Lee, who is the global head of ESG research at MSCI. We will then listen to two messages from Shimara Vikramanayake, who is the managing director and CEO of Macquarie, and Alok Sharma, who is the president of COP26. After the coffee break, then there will be Randy Quarles, who is governor, vice chairman of the US Federal Reserve and chair of the Financial Stability Board, who will report on the activity of the working group on data and disclosures, followed by Mark Carney, who is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, and he will discuss the proposals of the working group on private sector incentives. So I start without further ado, and I give the floor to Larry Fink. Larry, please. It works.
Good, thank you. Well, what a pleasure to travel again. So in a world of COVID, traveling again is really, it's fun. So I recommend it for everybody. I want to thank the finance minister and the governor for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure. In 1450, the Venetian cartographer Fra Mauro created his Mappa Mundi, the most accurate map ever drawn. He created the map not by drawing it, but he spoke to many people. And through that, he was able to learn from traders and explorers and refugees that were actually out there navigating the world. As we try to draw the map for our pathway to net zero, that's what I'd like to share today, what I've learned from my conversations with conservationists and conversations with and experiences and events over the last couple years. We all know we want to get to a net zero. Now we need a realistic map for how to get there. In 2015, a global consensus emerged in Paris around limiting global warming, ideally to 1.5 degrees, and more recently around achieving a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Since that milestone, we've seen the physical impact of climate change, whether it is the unprecedented fires from Australia to the American West, to the Amazon, to the flooding here in Venice, around the world. And these physical effects, which will only continue to mount, are playing out in financial terms as well, as they increasingly impact insurance rates, reinsurance rates, and now more and more financial decisions. As an asset manager and a fiduciary to all our clients, BlackRock is at the nexus between the owners of capital and the companies and assets in which we invest on their behalf. That's why I wrote a CEO letter last year about the fundamental reshaping of the economy. I wrote that climate risk is investment risk, and that we would have a profound impact on their businesses and ultimately how investors will evaluate each company and each asset. And that BlackRock and other investors would increasingly be asking for greater transparency. into the ways that climate risk would affect each company's ability to grow, each company's ability to navigate itself, and how they're preparing for the future. Not all industries and companies are moving as fast as we'd like, but I do believe disclosures are improving dramatically, and we're beginning to see a real transformation in the corporate world as more and more companies commit to net zero plans. And I believe we will see continued progress as corporate disclosures, as more governments consider making corporate disclosures more mandatory. But we need greater global consistency in that disclosure, in the rulemaking. We need to put politics aside and create a standard taxonomy for sustainable reporting, or it won't work. Investors need a single standard by which to judge companies. As necessary and useful as some of these steps are, quite frankly, we're just at the easy part. In fact, there'll be nothing more than window dressing unless we begin to take steps that are more comprehensive, that are more long-term across the entire economies. If we hope to be successful in truly making sustainable progress, I see three critical issues that we need to address, and we need to address them now. First, we need to broaden the focus beyond just public companies. There's been a tremendous progress in the public markets recently. 2 years ago, I anticipated a tectonic shift in capital. Well, that shift is happening and just accelerating. Sustainable investing strategies globally saw nearly $400 billion in inflows in just 2020. And we are on track to grow almost twice as quickly this year. I believe that this is the beginning of the most profound transformation in the financial system that I've seen in my 40-plus years in finance. But the shift is happening mainly in public markets and only among public companies. Disclosure has reshaped behavior in dramatic ways. Most of them are really positive. But one negative effect is creating a massive incentive for public companies to divest dirty assets. By some estimates, by the end of the decade, oil and gas companies will divest more than $100 billion of assets. Divesting, whether done independently or mandated by a court, might move an individual company that BlackRock may support more, but the world is not getting any closer to the net zero. We're just moving them. And I think it's going to have the opposite impact of helping the environment. As private and state-owned companies produce a greater and greater share of oil and gas, there will be less scrutiny, less disclosures around global emissions. TCFD, of course, requires public companies not only to disclose their direct emissions, but also emissions throughout a company's supply chain or a bank's lending book. To reduce these Scope 3 emissions, big public companies and banks are now being cast as a role of an emission police, having to cut off businesses or lending to companies, often smaller companies, that have not yet reduced their own emissions. This will have the unintended consequences of fueling a backlash against our big companies, and it will promote a narrative big versus small, and will create greater and greater political polarization. We made important progress getting large companies to move forward. It's been a critical step. And now we need a comprehensive approach that applies to all companies. We need regulatories of all agencies to work comprehensively together so we can have a comprehensive taxonomy for all. And we need to make sure that approach is not just for public companies, but public companies and private companies alike. Second, as we move forward with the energy transition, we need to make sure that we are pushing just as hard on the demand side as we are on the supply side. Otherwise, we risk supply crises that drive up the cost for consumers, especially those who can at least afford, and it will make the transition politically untenable. We all know the political timeline is much shorter than the timeline that we are going to have to achieve. And so we have to find ways to calibrate that timeline. The gap in cost between clean energy and those that emit greater amount of greenhouse gases is still enormous for most things. And we need to be working to bring down the green premium. Rising oil prices will only mean greater dependence on coal in the emerging world. Therefore, we need to manage the supply and demand curve much more effectively. Virtually all the recent focus and real movement has been the supply side, while very little has been done on the demand side. And much of this morning's conversation was about carbon tax. And it works. It may not work politically. In fact, right now, demand for hydrocarbons in 2021 is actually accelerating, driving up energy prices. We're going to have to ask ourselves, especially with political elections coming up, will people accept $100 oil? Will people accept $120 oil in the short term? Will politicians accept that? While some, we see higher prices as a way to constrain demand, rising costs in the energy sector will only sow greater economic inequalities and a world of have and have-nots. This will feed political polarization, and we've already seen how populist leaders can undo years of work and progress with little more than a tweet. The solution has to focus on bringing down the green premium by changing behaviors and making huge investments in new technology while minimizing the stranding of assets. We've seen some progress of closing the green premium by bringing down the costs in the energy and transportation sector, but there are sectors like cement and steel that have been major sources of emission where there has been very little progress in terms of bringing down the green premium. The energy transition is going to require unprecedented investments in new technologies to decarbonize every sector of the economy. 60 years ago, when President John F. Kennedy committed to putting a man on the moon, it seemed like the greatest technological challenge ever undertaken. At the peak of the Apollo program, the U.S. government was spending more than 6% of discretionary spending on the space program. But that moonshot was modest compared to what we have to do to get to a carbon-free economy and the world we face. Yet government's ability to finance it is even more constrained. Right now, almost every government we are seeing with the U.S. infrastructure bill is relying on deficit spending. But deficit spending has its limits, we all know, especially when governments are also spending on the physical impact of climate change and the impact of COVID. If we're going to bring down the green premium, we need to get serious about attracting private capital for technology innovation. We need to approaches that fail to mobilize private capital are not going to be enough to get the job done. A successful transition that does not impose politically unpalatable costs on those who could least afford it, we require that we carefully balance supply and demand. At the same time, we need to mobilize public and private capital to bring down the green premium. Third and finally, and maybe the most important, we need to rethink how we're going to attract necessary capital to facilitate the transition in the emerging world. Economic development in each emerging market is going to depend on how quickly they become green. That will also require enormous capital. There is private capital that can be mobilized for the emerging markets, but we need to rethink the way international financial institutions can support low-carbon investments at scale. The IMF and the World Bank was created nearly 80 years ago based on the model of bank balance sheets. But the global world is very different today. Banks have Basel requirements. They are not the lender to the emerging world anymore. But the IMF and the World Bank have achieved great things and built strong networks and relationships in the emerging markets. But when it comes to unlocking fiduciary assets, pension fund assets, asset owner capital for sustainability, we need to rethink the role of these institutions. The transition of the emerging markets will require on reimagining these institutions for the world of sustainable investing. We need to rethink their model and I would urge that the owners of these institutions rethink in how capital is going to be deployed in the future. We need a financing system that isn't built around bank balance sheets, but one that is built to attract owner capital into sustainable investments in economies that offer long-term durable returns. The green banks that are being established around the world and currently under consideration in the U.S. as part of the infrastructure bill could be a powerful mechanism for accelerating green investments, but that's just not enough money. We need global solutions and international organizations that are willing or can legally mitigate the risks of investing in the emerging world. If we're going to attract what is needed in the emerging world, which is hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital for brownfield investing in other sustainable projects in the emerging world, we need more solutions that have been used historically by the mortgage-backed securities market, where some degree of losses, first loss pieces, are being absorbed before they impact private investors. BlackRock is pleased to have joined in creating the Climate Finance Partnership in conjunction with our government partners, France, Germany, and Japan, as well as philanthropic partners. This is a public-private structure designed to attract private capital for sustainable infrastructure like renewable power in emerging markets. Governments and philanthropic institutions are providing the subordinated capital as a means to provide risk and returns protection that attracts the private capital. Just this past week, we held our first close for this fund. This is the type of public-private partnership we need to provide first loss protection for investors. However, as excited I am about the partnership, we need solutions for a much greater magnitude. And if we don't have international institutions providing that kind of first loss position at greater scale than they do today, properly overseeing these investments and bringing down the cost of financing and cost of equity, we're not going to be able to really attract enough private capital necessary for the energy transition in the emerging world. While these challenges on the journey to net zero are massive, I remain an optimist. And I do believe that the climate transition presents a historic opportunity. By BlackRock's own research, the transition can drive as much as 25% higher cumulative GDP over the next 2 decades alone. And it represents an investment opportunity for long-term investors of as much as $50 trillion. As an asset manager, we know asset owners want to be part of this opportunity, but a lot has to change to make it happen, and so we could achieve it. We need a global, consistent approach that spans both public and private sectors. Each side needs to work together in defining sector-specific pathways for a net zero. We need to do as much as possible to mitigate rising energy prices to ensure a just transition for all stakeholders in the global economy. Careful planning, coordination, action, and continued migration and mitigation of the risks will be the way we can achieve our shared agenda and goals. Broad-based public policy and long-term planning are what's needed to drive change. We all know this is not going to be easy. We need a comprehensive plan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. Clearly, you spoke as much as an asset manager as somehow putting requests to the MDBs, the IMF, to try to somehow organize a way to convoy the funds that you can get in the private sector. Obviously, you need also to identify the projects which have to be financed by the NDBs and so on. So it's an engagement that really needs to have many, many working together. Let's see on the central bank side what can be done. Christine.
Well, thank you very much, Ignacio, and what a pleasure it is to be participating in this on that stage with eloquent and passionate speakers about the matters that we are all concerned about. Well, I completely agree with Larry that it is a lot of fun actually to see each other and to be in the same physical presence. I think that we are also going to learn a little bit from COVID in measuring our footprint and being sensible about the amount of traveling that we do on an ongoing basis. So this one is an exclusive, very peculiar forum and a meeting initiated by the Italian presidency that really warrants the trip. But I think that we will learn from that COVID period also to actually be mindful about how we travel and what for. This one is definitely worth it. So I don't think I need to spend much time to demonstrate that climate change and the transition to a carbon neutral economy pose substantial challenges for the economy and the financial system, with the potential to affect growth, inflation in the short term, but also over much longer horizon. Having my President of the European Central Bank hat on, I would argue that physical risks, stranded assets, and greater firm default risk expose the financial system to losses which may impair the transmission of monetary policy, which is what we central bankers are concerned about. And the Eurosystem's balance sheet itself is exposed to climate risks from the assets that we hold, notably through our asset purchase programs. Not all central banks purchase assets, but certainly the European system does and the ECB does. Now, some might ask, why would a central bank be bothered about that? Well, I would say in short that climate change has consequences for us as central bankers in pursuing our primary mandate of price stability and our other areas of competence, including supervision and financial stability. And granted, as you, Ignacio, said perfectly sensibly, and as I'm sure other very competent speakers said this morning, it is not the main job of central banks. It is the main job of governments, of parliament, to be responsible for facilitating an orderly transition, and they are the ones who hold the key tools in their hands. But having said that, central bankers, like everybody else, cannot be oblivious to the risks that are out there, especially if they affect their mandate of price stability. So central banks have to ask themselves, whatever they do, in which way they can contribute to reducing the impact of climate change while delivering on their mandate. And as a result, as Governor Visco just indicated, the impact of climate change on monetary policy was a significant element of our strategy review that took place over the last 12 months. And to summarize it briefly around a AAA, we concluded that we had a duty around analyzing, around advising, and around acting. So let me start with the first one. We need to analyze better. And the ECB has been advancing its analysis, quantifying the potential impact of climate on the economy and on the financial system. Let me give you an example that we are conducting now. The results have not yet been published. They will be published later in July. We are conducting an economy-wide climate-related stress test of the financial system. And the exercise assesses the resilience of banks to various climate scenarios that have been produced by the NGFS, and it covers approximately 4 million companies worldwide and 1,600 consolidated banks. So 40 million corporates on the one hand, 1,600 banks on the other hand. We map those gigantic databases to identify what risks the banks are exposed to. And that covers, as you can imagine, all the euro area banks at the moment, or pretty much all of them. Now, let me get quickly to a sort of a preview of the findings that will be published soon. Number one, it's clearly necessary and more beneficial to act early and to ensure an orderly transition. It goes without saying, but it's quite nice to actually produce that as a good and tangible research identification. Number two, while transition costs may be higher in the short term, they are much lower in the long run than the cost of unrestrained climate change. So the immediate cost pale in comparison with the long-term consequences of not doing that and not investing now. 3, physical risks are the most significant source of climate-related vulnerability. And in specific relation to banks, what we've also identified is that without further and deeper climate policies, the most vulnerable 10% of the banks may see a 30% increase in the average probability of default of their credit portfolios between now and 2050. 30% increase. So watch out for that publication. It's a mine of really interesting information. Second thing that we are doing also in the category of better analyzing is that we are accelerating the development of new models and tools to incorporate the impacts of climate change and related policies into our regular monitoring of the economy. We will include carbon prices in our common technical assumptions and update it regularly. We will regularly evaluate the impact of climate policies and improve our modeling of the impact of extreme weather events on output and inflation in the near term and in the longer term estimates of potential output. That's on the analyzing front. On the advising front, we have issued a guide just last year of our supervisory expectations of how banks should manage and disclose these risks. But you know what? A substantial majority of those banks actually, when they audit themselves in accordance with the guidelines that we've given, recognize that they do not meet expectations. The banks themselves found out that 90% of reported practices only partially meet our requirements or do not do it at all. And it's only 20% of the banks that have a systematic way of assessing climate risks. Yet, almost all that do have found climate risks to be already here are having a material impact on their risk profile. So it matters a lot to their risk profile. They do not really report as well as they should, and many of them hardly report as expected. So we continue, and we will continue to encourage them to do so. On a second front, we continue to advocate in European and in international fora for the important precondition of the green transition. I know it was much talked about this morning, an effective carbon price that reflects the true cost of carbon, greater and better climate disclosures. There will be more talked about, I'm sure, under Erki's leadership, and the completion of the EU Capital Market Union. Now, indeed, to deter greenwashing, it is vital that disclosure data are complete, internationally consistent, and auditable. They do not have to be the same and exactly the same across the board, but they have to be consistent and they have to be auditable. The euro has taken the lead as the currency of choice for green bond issuance, and that can help catalyze further development of euro area capital markets, provided the right regulatory conditions are put in place. Third, we aim to disseminate our analysis and enrich the wider policy debate and spread awareness of the potential impact of climate change, including through our involvement in the NGFS, the Network for Greening of Financial System, and the ECB is committed to contributing to the Climate Training Alliance, which aims to enhance the training resources that are made available to national financial authorities. Now, moving to the third category, and that's to me the most important one, because we just have to do it. So building on this analysis, the ECB will act within its mandate, will act to contribute to mitigating and averting climate change using the tools, the avenues, and the competence that it has. The Eurosystem has already laid the foundations in several areas. It has agreed on a common stance for applying sustainable and responsible investment principles for some non-monetary policy portfolios, and that applies to all national central banks that are part of the Eurosystem. And since January, we have been accepting in our bond purchases program sustainability-linked bonds as collateral, which used not to be the case because we always only accepted those that had guaranteed and linear coupon. This is no longer the case. And hopefully that will be an encouraging sign. Now, following the conclusion of our strategy review, which has kept us busy for 12 effective working months and 6 months put aside because of COVID, the Governing Council has actually committed to further including climate considerations into our policy operations. Not the framework. Framework we've talked about, but the operations. So let me mention just a few examples. We will develop new experimental indicators covering relevant green financial instruments and the carbon footprint of financial institutions, as well as their exposure to climate-related physical risks. 2, we will introduce disclosure requirements for private sector assets as a new eligibility criterion or as a basis for differentiated treatment for collateral and asset purchases. So it's disclosure and it's assessment of the value as well, or combination of both. 3, we will start conducting climate stress tests of the Eurosystem balance sheet in 2022 to assess the Eurosystem's risk exposure to climate change, leveraging on the methodology of the ECB's economy-wide climate stress test. 4, we will also consider relevant climate change risks when reviewing the valuation and risk control frameworks for assets that are mobilized as collateral by counterparties for Eurosystem credit operations. And we will adjust the framework guiding the allocation of corporate bond purchases to incorporate climate change criteria in line with our mandate. So we're not pushing the boundaries of our mandate. This is not mission creep either. It is within our mandate with the objective of price stability, with the framework and the operations as we have them. We include climate change as part and parcel of our strategy and how we will implement it. Is it going to happen overnight? No, because obviously we are working in close cooperation with the Commission and we expect a lot from the Commission. But I know my colleague and friend, Mr. Gentiloni, is going to speak to those items. So the ECB has committed itself to take those measures and will itself actually reduce its own carbon footprint in line with the requirements of the Paris Agreement. And the ECB banking supervision will ensure that every bank is making swift progress in embedding climate risks into their organizational drawing on the full supervisory toolkit at our disposal when necessary. So I will not prolong this talk, but I want to bounce back from somebody that you, Larry, mentioned, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And he's also the one who said, when launching Apollo and commenting on this unbelievable adventure of going to the moon, he said, you know, we're not going to the moon because it's easy. We are going to the moon because it is hard. Well, I think we are not tackling climate change because it is easy, because it will be hard. We're doing it because we have to do it, and it will be hard, but we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you said many things, and all this is food for thought, but one thing that you said remained to me immediately: the short-term cost pales vis-à-vis the cost of not doing anything. This applies to climate change as it applied this morning or during our meetings when we discussed the preemptive needs of acting on pandemics, future pandemics. I mean, the amazing thing is that in this time we learn to work together. And so, I mean, let's capitalize on that. Thank you very much. But you also mentioned that you expect very much from the European Commission. And so let's see whether the European Commission can respond to these requests.
Of course. No, thank you very much. And again, my gratitude to the Italian presidency. We even went to a theater yesterday evening, which was quite moving. First time since long time. And of course, for all the rest. You know that this, what we call the European Green Deal, this commitment on the carbon neutrality in 2050 has been, since the beginning, the identity card of the new European Commission. Before the pandemic, and strongly so. We defined it since the beginning as our new growth strategy. Then the pandemic came, and indeed we could have put on hold this, saying, well, major problems, and it's difficult to have these two challenges together. As you know, we are trying, and we tried already, with decision already taken, to do the opposite, and so to increase our ambition during the pandemic. I will not bother you with the next generation EU, because I hope that you know everything about, but only remembering the fact that of this unprecedented common debt, we are having, now that we have analyzed quite the huge majority of the plans, we have 39% of these plans dedicated to measures and investment climate-related. You know that we have 30% of this fund in green bonds, of course, with all the discussion on what is the standard of green bonds. And we have every single measure and investment, and I assure you that we have thousands of measures and investments analyzed through what we call the do no significant harm principle. This means that you have 39% of the investment that is climate-related, but nothing, at least in theory, if our analysis was effective, that is against the climate transition. So the idea is that we are not looking only for a rebound in our economies, but we are hoping to use this rebound to change it and to have a more sustainable growth. Now, you know that we also decided, and it is a climate law approved already by the co-legislators, to increase the ambition of the reduction of the emissions from 40% to 55% by 2030. And this is the target of the package that the Commission will approve on Wednesday. I think it is the largest legislative package that the European Commission have ever delivered. So, of course, I will not enter in all these things, but just to remember you a few. First, we will extend our emission trade system, which is there since 2005 and is our carbon pricing system, and it will be extended. Second, we will review a lot of directives, energy taxation, renewables, energy efficiency. Third, we will introduce new emission standards for cars, for example. Fourth, we will have measures to incentivize alternative fuels for transport. And fifth, just to mention the main measures, we will adopt a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Because, of course, the increase of this ambition also increases the risk of carbon leakage. And if we have European companies leaving the EU because of these higher standards, or if we encourage foreign companies that have lower standards in their countries to enlarge their role in the European market, the result will not be a good one for the climate balance. Quite the opposite. So we need this, and of course we need that this mechanism is not a problem with the WTO rules, so we will use what we have, the emission trade system, and mirror it towards our toward imports, and establishing the same price for production, domestic production, and imported production on the basis of their carbon content. Of course, technically not easy, but I think that this experience that will be very gradual in its phasing in and phasing out of other measures will be useful at a global level. All this package, I have to be honest with you, is a difficult package to be fair and just. Because, yes, don't expect unanimity in our societies on these packages, because it's not the case. It could be the case when you say climate neutrality by 2050, but then if you speak about heating of houses, about prices of transport, well, the balance between what we decide and what we give back with social compensation, with just transition schemes, as we call them, is so important. You may remember Chrystia Freeland explaining their experience where they have a very ambitious level of carbon pricing, but also a form of restitution of revenues. It's not revenues for the government. This is a climate measure. So the EU package will be mixed from this point of view. It's not exactly the Canadian model, but the need to be fair and just is there. From this point of view, of course, all this strategy is important to give clarity to investors and to this enormous shift that Larry Fink was mentioning in the appetite of investors. Because this appetite is there, but it needs strategy and clarity. And this is what we can try to do at European level. It doesn't solve all the problem, of course, but I think is important. I completely support what Christine said, and I think that the bank review is extraordinary from this point of view and others. And at the end of the day, keeping our autonomy, of course, the Commission and the bank will work together. This is also something new that happened because of the pandemic, this interplay between monetary and fiscal in fiscal policy. So we support progress towards the global sustainability reporting standards. We have our proposal on corporate sustainability reporting, trying to answer both to the demand of information on impact of climate risks for companies, but also on impact of companies themselves on the environment, because we need reporting on these two streams. And finally, we introduced the EU taxonomy for green investment. We are proud to have this green list, but of course we are aware of the fact that we need a global, so to say, green list. And this is my final word. All the things we are mentioning, carbon pricing, taxonomies, reporting, I think they need a balance between ambition and cooperation. And this is my message. Of course, we need to rethink our institution, and we can do this now because of the pandemic and because of the green challenge. it's now or never from a certain point of view. You can count on the European Union because we proudly will continue to be ambitious, but we are aware of the fact that we need graduality and global coordination, because without this, we will go nowhere. So we can't stop our ambition, this is my opinion, but we have to make it gradual and working together to have a real global cooperation, because of course, only together we will save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Obviously, the do not significant harm principle is easy to say. It's very hard to follow in the sense that, as you mentioned, there will be consequences, and we have to think how to compensate for these consequences. The Canadians have done it. It is more difficult in an area which has so many stakeholders and country stakeholders, but obviously we cannot refrain from that. You also mentioned the reporting, the taxonomy, all issues that I'm sure Linda Eiling-Lee, who is the global head of exactly the ESG research at MSI, will take. Please, Linda.
Well, I'm really honored to join you today to discuss the role of capital in the net zero economy. I'm going to begin with a question. What will be the largest companies in the world in 2050, so 30 years from now? Well, obviously, we don't know that. What we do know is that today, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Taiwan Semiconductor, these are among the largest public companies in the world. These are the giants that we know from the digital revolution that has really changed all of our lives in the last 30 years. But we should really recall that of the 10 largest companies today, 7 of them didn't actually even exist 30 years ago. So we meet here today at the dawn of another revolution. We think that investors are asking, which companies will thrive or are going to die in the next 30 years. So as we drive emissions to zero, assets are going to be repriced and industries will be unrecognizable. And so this is the net zero revolution. With more than $14.5 trillion that are benchmarked to MSCI's indexes, plus our market leadership in ESG data, ESG ratings, and analytics, we are asked by investors every day how to navigate a low carbon economy. Equally, we're asked by thousands of companies why investors are evaluating their climate strategies. So I'd like to share 3 things with you today that we see at the nexus between companies and investors. First is that what investors are holding in their portfolios today isn't going to work for 2050. There are over 9,000 companies in 50 countries in MSCI's broadest market index. This represents the global equity universe. Now, these companies are putting carbon into the atmosphere at a rate that takes the world to more than 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century. By our calculation, over 90% of all public companies today are not on track to reduce their emissions for keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. Now, how can an investor actually reduce their carbon intensity of their portfolio if the companies in those portfolios aren't actually doing so? Investors really have 2 choices: influence or reallocate. So as share owners, investors must influence and put pressure on company boards and management to transform their business models. Investors, however, they do need every company on average to reduce carbon intensity by about 10% every year until 2050, just to keep us under 1.5 degrees. That's not going to be easy because we have found, of course, that historically fewer than 1 in 4 companies has actually managed to reduce their emissions by quite this much. This is just a lot to ask. Or investors can reallocate. Investors can move more of their capital to the decarbonizing companies and away from those that are moving too slowly or maybe not even acting at all. But here too, there's a hard limit. Remember, 90% of companies are running too hot, right? Meaning that their emissions trajectory would actually take us beyond a 1.5 to 2 degree rise in temperature. Now, these too hot companies, they're really no longer investable options for a growing number of institutional investors. But these institutional investors have very large pools of capital, and they can't just invest in a smaller and smaller set of companies. So what the world actually really needs are new companies. They need new businesses to invest in. We really need the tech companies of the future, really the innovators of the net zero revolution. Second, the net zero revolution is going to produce not just losers that are holding carbon-stranded assets, but some spectacular winners. So a moment ago, I told you some of the largest companies in the world today. In 1995, at the dawn of the internet, the largest companies included General Electric, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Petroleum, Philip Morris. Not one was a technology company. Back then, the market value of the tech sector was about 6% of the global equity universe. Today, it's roughly about 20%. Now, at the dawn of the net zero revolution, we're estimating that fewer than 3% of the companies in the MSCI index actually earn a majority of their revenues from clean energy or low carbon technologies. So this revolution begins with these companies helping to transform how we produce and how we consume energy. But in time, this revolution won't just be about displacing traditional fossil fuel companies with renewable energy businesses. It's going to be much bigger than that. Just as the digital revolution has reached far beyond the tech sector to really reach every part of our economy, the net zero revolution is not limited to the energy sector. It's going to touch every company in the world sooner than they imagine. Experience has shown us, though, that identifying the winners of the future is not very straightforward. For every Amazon, dozens, if not hundreds of e-commerce companies have fallen by the wayside. And we tend to forget all the social media sites that died off in the wake of Facebook. This push that we have now for sustainability will likewise see its share of failures. Green startups, which remember are still startups, many companies that are competing to invent low carbon solutions are not going to succeed. Yet some, including ones that may not even exist today, could actually emerge as the titans of a net zero world. So third, how can investors then investigate this future that we've been talking about from the present? Well, in part, they're using indexes. So think of a basket of companies. An index measures the performance of that basket. So if the basket actually has every company in the world in it, then you can weigh the emissions of the world's companies. And then when we embed forward-looking climate metrics, you can get a temperature reading, which tells you that the world's companies would take us to over 3 degrees warmer. Now, I'd like you to imagine that you're at the supermarket. You can choose which companies to actually put into your shopping basket. Next to the prices, you see emissions, or you see a conversion of emissions to a temperature. You can see how every company you put into your shopping basket actually adds to the basket's emissions and changes the basket's temperature. Over the next 3 decades, if the companies of the world actually succeed in decarbonizing, an index like MSCI's index that measures the basket that contains all of the world's public companies, so really the whole supermarket, if you will, the MSCI All-Country World will become a low-carbon index, one that indicates a lower and lower temperature. But we're not there yet, right? So between now and then, investors are using different indexes that integrate their climate concerns. They're creating alternative shopping baskets of what they consider to be healthier choices to take their investments on a faster glide path towards that convergence. So then what do investors actually need to take them into this revolution? Our current market infrastructure has evolved to facilitate capital flows that support a carbon-intensive economy. What we really need is a market infrastructure that's oriented differently, one that actually supports sustainability. A critical component are new types of measurements that show how vulnerable or how resilient every asset is to climate change. These are measurements that can be used as a common language among market participants so that we can value the emerging risks and opportunities in the new economy. These new types of measurements, they require data that we don't have today. And as we look forward to what COP26 could achieve, we urge policymakers and financial regulators of the G20 and the rest of the world to introduce mandatory climate-related disclosures and agree on international standards of disclosure. But we caution regulators and standard setters not to confuse what should be disclosed by companies with what can and should be measured by analysts, by investors, and regulators. So instead of asking companies to each report on their own assessment of climate risk, which will inevitably produce a lot of inconsistent data, ask them for the basic ingredients which they can all disclose immediately. Right now, we lack data on companies' full emissions throughout their entire value chain. And we critically lack disclosures on where their operations are located. These are actually the absolute minimum inputs into any climate risk analysis. So in other words, ask companies for the inputs, and the market will converge on the most decision-useful outputs. And this is how we will collectively construct the pipes for a new market infrastructure. So MSCI will play its part. I'm very pleased today to announce that MSCI will join with the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero as part of the Race to Zero campaign to spearhead a Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. This new alliance will galvanize the world's index and data providers, credit rating agencies, and accounting firms to really lay the tracks that can take investors and companies to a net zero world. It would be great if when we look back on 2021, decades from now, we can actually say that this is the moment when the world leaned into its low carbon future, when we entered an era of enterprise and collaboration to make the net zero revolution a reality. Thank you.
So there is a lot of action going on, not only on the part of the asset managers, the central banks, the political community, but also on the part of those who provide services to all those who have to invest and then produce. Thank you very much, Linda. Linda Elling, I think. I don't know whether your name is both or only the first one.
You can call me Linda, but it's Linda Elling. Yes, it's my first name.
Okay, thank you. Now we have two pre-recorded messages. There will be short messages, but I think they are worthwhile listening to and seeing them. The first is from Shamara Vikramanayake, who is the Managing Director and CEO of Macquarie. Please.
It's a pleasure to be joining you today from Sydney. We gather more certain than ever that we are in the decisive decade in our drive towards net zero, and that this is the pivotal year in that decade as we work to deliver inclusive growth and a just transition. While our progress and momentum give us grounds for optimism, we also need to be clear-eyed on the challenges. Our optimism comes from the progress we see in developed countries where solutions are being deployed at ever-increasing scale. With continued commitment, a pathway to net zero is in sight for many countries. This progress reflects successful partnerships between the public and the private sectors, where governments have set clear direction and investment frameworks, businesses have developed technology, projects, and delivery capability. We in the finance community have worked on innovative ways to fuel the transition with private capital, helping to deliver it at speed and scale. One of our greatest challenges is how we now replicate that success in emerging markets, a defining issue for all countries at COP26. It is in emerging markets where demand for energy is rising most, up 70% in the past decade versus flat demand in Europe and the US. And yet in these markets, it's where investment has remained stubbornly low. For every dollar invested in energy transition in emerging markets, we've seen $20 invested in developed markets. And while these modest levels of investment have been concentrated in renewables, investment in climate resilience is further behind, despite an increasingly urgent need. Low levels of investment, however, do not signal a lack of ambition. Governments from more than 80 emerging markets have declared their intent to set a net zero target, and they're aware of the need to work on policy frameworks that will attract capital. But at the same time, we need to recognise that much of that capital will belong to pensioners and insurance holders who need appropriate risk-adjusted returns while also delivering sound community outcomes. We've seen these dynamics play out in Macquarie's long-standing involvement in infrastructure investment globally. The challenges are the same for infrastructure focused on emissions reduction. Progress has been weighted towards a small number of markets, their success rooted in strong enabling environments for clean energy investment, attracting private capital. This remains the exception. Put simply, emerging markets face a significant finance gap that is holding back their ambitions and their transitions. And that's why I'm pleased to support two important initiatives, both designed to help mobilise greater volumes of private capital to accelerate the transition of emerging markets. Earlier this year at President Biden's summit, Mark Carney, with the UN Climate Actions Champions, launched the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, bringing together financial firms from across the world to work together to support the transition to net zero. And alongside important GFAN's work in areas such as transition pathways for hard-to-abate sectors, I'm proud on behalf of Macquarie to lead the GFAN's work stream to accelerate capital mobilisation for climate solutions in emerging markets. We'll be seeking broad input now on our priorities, but I expect them to include actions in the four following areas. Firstly, working with governments on their specific challenges to help create tailored enabling environments to attract that capital. Secondly, strengthening collaboration between private capital and multilateral development banks and development finance institutions to deliver financing solutions. Thirdly, scaling up the great work of existing catalytic initiatives such as the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative, which I'll talk about, Fast Infra, and the UN's Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance. And ultimately accelerating the flow of private climate finance into emerging markets, connecting willing capital to a growing pipeline of investable projects. Now, one of the initiatives that GFAN's members will be looking to harness is, as I mentioned, the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative. CFLI is a group of 7 leading institutions from across the investment value chain. And this initiative, convened by Michael Bloomberg, has been working for some time to mobilise private climate finance in emerging markets. And in the next phase, we're focused on driving practical outcomes in some key countries. These two complementary initiatives will, I hope, help strengthen the engagement of private investors in the multifaceted challenge of emerging markets and build on the important work of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. I believe that the finance community can play an important role alongside governments and other corporates in the vital transition of emerging markets, and we are ready to play our part. Thank you.
Very good. So now we go to the President of COP26, Minister of the UK Government, Alok Sharma. Let's see.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Minister Franco and Governor Visco for organising this conference. Friends, climate change is the greatest challenge that we face, and we must act now to protect people and nature from its impacts and drive down global emissions. In 2015, the countries of the world signed the Paris Agreement and committed to do all they could to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and closer to 1.5 degrees. Now, to keep that 1.5 degree limit within reach, we must halve global emissions by 2030. And these efforts depend on finance. Without it, the task ahead is near impossible. So one of my key aims for COP26 is to get finance flowing to climate action, both public finance and private finance. And we must all respond with the urgency the crisis demands, particularly to mobilize public and private finance into emerging markets and developing countries where the need is greatest, and help to build green economies, creating jobs and prosperity. On climate, the G20 nations must lead. And of course, I welcome the progress made by finance ministers and central bank governors over the last 2 days, and I am encouraged by the work of the Sustainable Finance Framework and Infrastructure Working Groups and the Financial Stability Board. Now, when it comes to public finance, it is essential that developed countries deliver the $100 billion a year that they have promised to developing countries. In 2018, we mobilized $80 billion, a significant amount, but not enough. And as I've always said, delivering the full $100 billion is a matter of trust. So I welcome the fact that under the UK presidency, every G7 country has committed to increase its public finance commitments, including finance for adaptation. Canada, Germany and Japan have put new money on the table immediately after the G7 summit. And I look forward to other donors, including other G7 countries, stepping up with new or increased commitments ahead of COP26. And I'm pleased that the IMF is preparing a $650 billion allocation of special drawing rights. The G7 has made clear that they want to channel almost a sixth of the newly allocated SDRs to support healthy, green and resilient recoveries from COVID-19 in the poorest and most vulnerable countries. And I very much support this call and want other countries to back the G7's approach. And I want to see a much more ambitious level of SDR recycling from the richer nations than we saw immediately after the 2009 financial crisis. So I urge richer countries and the IMF to respond urgently to the G7's call on SDRs and the G20 to address the debt challenges faced by developing countries. I also urge multilateral development banks to take action. Every MDB should set a date by which they will align with the Paris Agreement, as the World Bank and the EBRD have done. And every MDB should meet their climate finance targets, increasing them where possible, and develop plans to mobilize more private finance. And when it comes to private finance, we're of course working closely with finance ministers in coordination with the efforts of Mark Carney to ensure that every financial decision takes climate into account. And members of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, today represents over $88 trillion of assets, all signed up to science-based targets to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 at the latest. This is good news, yet we know barriers exist to investment in emerging markets. Many can seem too risky to attract large-scale institutional capital, and investors are cautious. Yet we know that emerging markets hold enormous investment opportunities. The IFC estimates that there are nearly $23 trillion in opportunities for climate-smart investments in emerging markets between now and 2030. So, as Sharma has just said, we must bring public and private finance together to break down the barriers to investment and to support a just and inclusive transition to global net zero. And I welcome Macquarie leading the GFAN's work to accelerate this capital into emerging markets. And I welcome today's discussion on how MDBs can support the transition to global net zero. I urge MDBs and private financial firms to increase their collaboration and scale up blended finance initiatives and technical assistance, and to improve the conditions for investment within countries and build pipelines of high-quality bankable projects. Together, you can demonstrate that public finance can de-risk investment and leverage insignificant private capital. So ahead of COP, I encourage MDBs to share plans for mobilizing private finance faster, and I urge private financial institutions to work with MDBs on these plans to help show how finance will flow in support of countries' ambitious plans for climate action. Such steps are essential if we're to redirect the sums flowing through the global economy towards our green future and secure the trillions of dollars required to build resilience, meet global net zero, and keep the 1.5 degree limit alive. These collaborative efforts must endure far beyond COP26. Friends, this is the decisive decade, and the decisions you take now will set the course of the planet. Business as usual is not an option. So let's work together to divert finance from the polluting industries of the past towards our clean, green, and resilient future, creating jobs and growth in every corner of the globe. Thank you.